We are delighted to move into our lecture part of our program. First, I do want to thank our student board for leading us in such a meaningful prayer service of Christian unity. Thank you very, very much. I do want to invite to the podium someone who's not listed in our program, but has some very special greetings to bring. Father Stefanos Alexopoulos is a professor of liturgical studies here at Catholic University, and he brings special greetings for us.
Warm greetings and welcome. And my name is Father Stefanos Alexopoulos. I'm Associate Professor of Liturgical Studies and Sacramental Theology and Director of the Institute for the Study of Eastern Christianity here at the Catholic University of America, and the priest of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America. And as such, I have the great honor and privilege today to represent His Eminence Archbishop Elpidophoros, the primate of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese, who regrets not being able to be present today on this wonderful occasion. His Eminence instructed me to convey his warm paternal greetings and blessings to all, and would particularly wish to wholeheartedly congratulate Father John Chryssavgis. It is always a joy to see the hard work and dedication of a faithful servant of the Lord, like Father John, a clergyman of the Archdiocese, who faithfully serves the Ecumenical Patriarchate as an Archdeacon of the Ecumenical throne, and for him to be recognized at the national level in this ecumenical forum. Please join me in congratulating our honored brother in Christ and wish him success in his present and future ministries.
Now I would like to invite to the podium Father Paul McPartland, who has been deep inspiration for this consortium since its beginning, I think, almost. Not quite the beginning, you're not that old. But for a number of years, Professor McPartland is the Carl Peter Professor of Systematic Theology here at Catholic University, and he comes to introduce our award winner and speaker.
Thank you very much, Larry. Dear friends, it's a great pleasure to introduce the distinguished recipient of this year's Ecumenism Award from the Washington Theological Consortium, Archdeacon John Chryssavgis. Long before I met Father John, when we were both speakers at an event at the Huffington Ecumenical Institute at Loyola Marymount in California in spring 2015, I knew his name from the covers of books, many books, and I marveled at his astonishing productivity across a whole range of subjects. If I've counted correctly, he has authored or edited something like 50 books, not to mention countless articles, both scholarly and popular, on Orthodox theology and spirituality, with a particular concern, I think we can say, for the life and witness of orthodoxy today, as humanity faces immense issues, such as the ecological crisis, and most recently, of course, the horrendous war launched by Russia against Ukraine, exactly 1 year ago tomorrow. A war that Pope Francis just yesterday called absurd and cruel, and that Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew has not hesitated to call diabolical. Father John himself has been unsparing in his commentary over this past year, expressing the outrage that so many feel. as well as making wonderful contributions of his own to ecological discussion, such as his 2019 book on creation as sacrament. In a number of volumes, Father John has particularly helped the world to know and appreciate the ecological commitment and pioneering initiatives over many years of Patriarch Bartholomew himself, to whom Pope Francis paid a warm and extensive tribute at the start of his own 2015 encyclical on ecology, Laudato Si, using quotations from a volume of the Patriarch's addresses edited by Father John. The following year, 2016, Pope Francis indeed provided the preface for a book written by Father John to mark the 25th anniversary of the election of Bartholomew as Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople. The book was entitled Bartholomew, Apostle and Visionary. That same year, of course, 2016, saw the historic Holy and Great Council of the Orthodox Church held in Crete, as well as the plenary meeting in Chieti of the International Catholic Orthodox Dialogue that produced an agreed statement on synodality and primacy in the first millennium. In a remarkable contribution to that intensely synodal kairos, full of ecumenical implications, Father John commissioned nearly 40 Orthodox and Catholic bishops and theologians to contribute substantial papers on various aspects of primacy in the Church, which were duly published in 2016 in 2 splendid volumes. I well remember the gentle insistence with which Father John encouraged me, and I'm sure others also, to contribute. And I'm very glad that I did. From these brief indications, I trust it is already clear that we are honoring tonight a man of wisdom and a man of action, passionately engaged with the life of the Church today, especially in its ecumenical and ecological aspects, forthright in his own views, a quality we Brits always admire in our Australian cousins, and prodigiously productive, someone who doesn't just muse about what might be done, written, and published, but actually makes things happen. His address to us tonight has the title Towards an Ecumenical Outlook, Reviving Foundational Principles of Ecumenism. And I, for one, can't wait to hear what he has to say. I'm sure he will remind us of some home truths. The respective forewords to the 2 volumes on primacy that I just mentioned were written by Metropolitan Kallistos Ware and Metropolitan John Zizoulas, both of whom, Father John said, had, and I quote, blazed fresh and creative, albeit orthodox and normative trails on the questions of primacy and synodality, end of quote. The ability to be fresh and creative while remaining orthodox is a gift he clearly esteems. Sadly, both Metropolitan Kallistos and Metropolitan John have died within the past 6 months. May their memory be eternal. And Father John has written moving tributes to them both, which take us back into his own earlier life. What I always admired most about Zizoulas, he said, was his eagerness for encounter and engagement with other confessions and other disciplines, especially with science and art. He was convinced that without such openness to dialogue, orthodoxy was destined to become little more than a ghetto on the margins of society. End of quote. Again, we see that concern with the living and life-giving witness of orthodoxy in today's world. Father John was born and grew up in Australia, but then studied for his degree in theology at the University of Athens, where he was excited to discover Zizioulas's recent writings on personhood, which were to develop so momentously in the years that followed. Having gained his degree there in 1980, he then went to study for his doctorate at Oxford for 3 years, with then still archimandrite, but soon to be Bishop Callistos. I quote again, "What drew many, including me, to Oxford," he wrote recently in his tribute to Bishop Metropolitan Callistos, "what drew many, including me, to Oxford was his rare combination of the scholarly and the spiritual, academia and asceticism, of patristic literature and profound liturgy, of Orthodox Christianity as a living and life-changing tradition." End of quote. Again, we see what Father John admires. You can tell a lot about a person by knowing their heroes. Movingly, he adds, with regard to Metropolitan Callistos, "I never stopped being his student. He was supportive at every new dimension and turn of my ministry and teaching. He guided and read everything that I wrote over the last 30 years, which included preparing, when he was already quite ill, the foreword for my latest publication on the 5th century elders from Gaza, Barsanuphius and John, whose letters he introduced me to as his student." End of quote. That latest book, published just last year, builds upon the 2 volumes of letters of Barsanuphius and John, translated by Father John and published by our own CUA Press in the famous Fathers of the Church series in 2014 and 2015, the first complete English translation of their voluminous correspondence from the original Greek. Father John gave a remarkable lecture on Saints Barsanuphius and John at a special event just last March here at Catholic University in the presence of His Eminence, Archbishop Elpidophorus, and many others. So we see that at heart, Father John is actually a very distinguished patristic scholar, specializing, as he says, in the desert fathers and mothers from the 4th to the 7th centuries. He returned to Australia after Oxford, co-founded St. Andrew's Theological College in Sydney, and served there as sub-dean, teaching patristics and church history from 1986 to 1995. And also teaching in the Divinity School at the University of Sydney. In 1995, he came here to the USA, to Boston, to be professor of theology at Holy Cross School of Theology until 2002. For many years, he has served as a special theological advisor and close collaborator of Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, especially on environmental issues. In 2012, he was named Archdeacon of the Ecumenical Throne by His All Holiness. In 2016, he was awarded an honorary doctorate by St. Vladimir's Theological Seminary in New York. And in 2020, he was elected as Honorary Professor of Theology by the Sydney College of Divinity. Father John, we're proud and delighted that tonight the Washington Theological Consortium is adding its annual Ecumenism Award for 2023 to your many other awards and distinctions. I'm sure we all agree there could hardly be a worthier recipient. Many congratulations.
can all come up. Oh, you need to get the mic. Okay, wait, you want? Oh, I thought you were gonna have that. Oh, okay. Very good. No peeking. We now move to the segment of our presentation of the award.
Excuse me, Larry.
What?
I've got a special bulletin.
What?
This arrived by email this morning. Reverend Dr. Larry Goldman, Executive Director of the Washington Theological Consortium, honored members of the Board of Trustees, faculty, students, and distinguished guests are beloved in the Lord. Grace be unto you and peace from God. It is with particular joy that we are pleased to address this greeting to you as you gather at the Catholic University of America this evening on the occasion of the 2023 Figel Lecture and present this year's Ecumenism Award. As is well known, our Ecumenical Patriarchate, a founder of the World Council of Churches and a trailblazer in the field of ecumenism, has long been a proponent of dialogue, not only with Christians, but with the leaders of the other Abrahamic faiths and everyone of goodwill. Considering that your association has been inspired by such movements of Christian unity and shares many principles with our sacred institution, we were pleased to learn that the Reverend Dr. John Chryssavgis, Archdeacon of the Ecumenical Throne, would be rightly honored with the Consortium's annual Ecumenism Award for 2023. Archdeacon Chryssavgis' work and contributions as a theologian speak for themselves, especially observing his study of the Desert Fathers and his contributions to the Holy and Great Church's approach to the environment, such as through his assistance with organizing the Halki Summits and other theological, academic, and environmental endeavors. Recently, we recognized his initiative and contributions to the synodal document for the life of the world towards a social ethos of the Orthodox Church. Both through this work, which touches on many of the most pertinent social issues of the contemporary world in the eyes of the Holy and Great Council of the Orthodox Church in Crete 2016, but also in his many other works, Father John has dedicated his life to promoting understanding and cooperation among all people, regardless of their faith or beliefs. Most relevantly for the Washington Theological Consortium, his work towards interfaith dialogue and reconciliation is a true testament to his commitment to building bridges and fostering unity among all people, which in itself is something that humanity requires during this challenging period. Therefore, congratulating each and every one of you, especially Archdeacon John, for this recognition, we extend to all in attendance our paternal and patriarchal blessing, and the hope that you may receive the grace and illumination of the All-Holy Spirit, and that you may continue to grow in the understanding of one another's traditions, and will love one another with the great love with which he loves us. At the Ecumenical Patriarchate on the 23rd of February, 2023, your fervent supplicant before the Lord, Bartholomew, Archbishop of Constantinople, New Rome, and Ecumenical Patriarch.
I thought it was from my mother. I am really honored by this as our consortium is. We now come to the time of presentation of the Ecumenism Award of the Washington Theological Consortium. In your program, you'll see a long list of previous recipients, luminaries in the ecumenical movement. And today, we are especially privileged to award the 2023 Ecumenism Award to Archdeacon John Chryssavgis. And I'm going to have Jack read the inscription and present it to Deacon John.
Oh, maybe I can see it. The Board of Trustees of the Washington Theological Consortium presents the 2023 Ecumenism Award to Archdeacon John Chryssavgis for his outstanding contributions to ecumenical dialogue, scholarship, and education, especially related to the environment in the service of Christian unity. February 23rd, 2023, the 15th annual Figel event on ecumenism. Father John.
I think we should all go home at this point. Very, very touched. I don't know how to thank everyone from the students that put together that beautiful service. And you'll see many of the themes recurring in my own address this evening. Grateful to Father Paul for his very generous words. I need a copy for my sons. I want to give them a copy each. And for this award of the Consortium and for the opportunity to give the Figel Lecture this year. I have to open with a word of sincere gratitude for the award. I'm profoundly honored, not least because I'm aware of distinguished recipients in the past, among them my own teacher and mentor, the late Metropolitan Callistos Ware. And I'm also deeply humbled because I'm conscious of many deserving contenders, some of whom are in this room this evening. And I'm appreciative also for the opportunity to reflect on ecumenical principles as experienced and embraced in my own education and ministry. You have an outline of my talk with you that Jack was very kind to put together. Mostly so that you can understand some of the Greek names that I'll be pronouncing. My introduction is entitled Whither Ecumenism. That's whither with an H. I remember as a child in Australia, Aussies have really good commercials, by the way. Look them up, they're very funny. So with this elderly gentleman doing an ad for a hardware store, kind of a family hardware store like Ace here, and his name was Hudson, and he would do his own ads and he would say, remember Hudson, Hudson with a H. So this is whither with a H. Let me start with a couple of anecdotes because I think they're typically part and parcel of ecumenical settings anyway. Some years ago, I was asked by my patriarch, His All Holiness Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, whether I would contemplate directing the permanent delegation of the Ecumenical Patriarchate to the World Council of Churches in Geneva, hitherto held by Father George Tsetsis. It was a moving gesture, obviously, of confidence on the patriarch's part, and few would normally hazard rejecting an offer from the spiritual leader of the Orthodox world. But I admit I was not in the least tempted and respectfully declined on the spot. I felt that the golden age of the ecumenical movement, at least as we knew it, at least as I knew it, was behind us. My heroes like Fathers Lev Gillet and Cyril Argenti devoted their entire lives to ecumenical dialogue, contributing to milestone documents and groundbreaking events. And I had been involved in the Australian Council of Churches, appointed member of our patriarchal delegation to 2 World Council General Assemblies, and nominated to the Faith and Order Commission's World Conference in Santiago de Compostela. It was the mid-90s. I was in my mid-30s. Around the same time, 2 other very respected friends, Fathers Thomas Hopko and Stanley Harricus, confided in me their disillusionment with institutional ecumenism, expressing reservation about their own involvement and especially their church's impact in ecumenical circles. They were in their 60s and had participated in the ecumenical movement for decades. Even Father George Florovsky, an ecumenical pioneer and the architect of the Orthodox approach to ecumenism, was frequently disenchanted by a shift that he discerned within the ecumenical community from doctrinal intercourse to political interaction. What led to such skepticism, even cynicism? Orthodox theologians frequently limit their institutional obligation or individual contribution to denouncing any tendency toward minimalism or reductionism in ecumenical circles. The Toronto Statement on the Church, the Churches, and the World Council of Churches, adopted by the World Council's Central Committee in 1950, just 2 years after the formation of the World Council of Churches, went to painstaking efforts to discourage pontification by member churches on one another. But the risk with that is that ecumenical statements are reduced to bland platitudes without tangible or transformational impact, a criticism that I will return to later. The 20th century was rightly labeled the century of the ecumenical movement, but how should we envision ecumenical relations in the 21st century? In fact, so many of our optimistic, sometimes naive expectations from the second half of the last century have literally crumbled before our very eyes as the world grows increasingly divided. The reconfiguration of the ecumenical landscape is subject to polarizations that are influenced by the structuring of societal debates. So Christian churches and faith communities are clearly at a crossroads as far as their ecumenical engagement. There has definitely been much candid and constructive criticism of the ecumenical mandate over the years, as indeed there should be for every inspirational enterprise. But has this assessment resulted in the changes needed for our world and for our time? Does ecumenism require revision, even reinvention? Its work is certainly incomplete, but its context has clearly changed. Perhaps we're obliged to return to the foundational principles of ecumenism as universal and Catholic, or mutual and reciprocal. Of course, there is also good reason for gratitude. Over the last century, ecumenism has unmistakably proved conducive to peace. Convening and conciliating churches and communities estranged for centuries. But has this impacted the world around us? Does ecumenism live up to its initial intent? I must confess that what has undoubtedly sustained my own confidence and commitment to the ecumenical precept of the gospel, as Larry mentioned, is not so much any institution or ideology, but individuals embodying the value and vision of ecumenical encounter, a succession of charismatic leaders grounded in the faith once for all entrusted to God's people, and focused on Christ's agony that his disciples be one. There is, of course, a host of such theologians and leaders, a great cloud of witnesses to which I could refer. For my presentation, I wish to spotlight 3 influential figures in my own formation and life. Their names are before you. Bartholomew, Ecumenical Patriarch, Stylianos, former Archbishop of Australia, and Nikos Nisiotis. We start with the Patriarch. He was kind enough to send a letter for me, so I'm glad I'm starting off. Born in 1940, In my ministry, there's no doubt that I've been privileged to enjoy a front row position and perspective to the remarkable leadership of His All Holiness. His vision I would call an ecumenism of persistence, an unwavering determination for dialogue as an end in and of itself. Unity among all Christians is a pursuit of steadfast resolve, and for Bartholomew, this is not just a job description. It's the very DNA of his worldview as inherited from his predecessors, those who groomed him with an appreciation for ecumenical dialogue. In his Lenten encyclical of 2010, the Patriarch observed, orthodoxy must be in constant dialogue. Otherwise, it will no longer be Catholic, no longer be ecumenical, but instead be reduced, Father Paul quoted Metropolitan John, to a ghetto destined to remain on the margins of history. So dialogue is an integral element of Bartholomew's identity. But he's also convinced that it is the undeniable narrative of the gospel. To this end, an extended lineage of predecessors paved the way with the patriarchal encyclicals in Constantinople of 1902 and 1920, over 100 years ago, urging a renewal of conversation with other confessions and planting the seed for what would become known as the ecumenical movement. Ecumenism is in the heart of the Church of Constantinople. And while the first of these historical letters in 1902 was signed by Ecumenical Patriarch Joachim, I quote, to the venerable autocephalous Orthodox churches, the second one in 1920 was addressed, I quote, to all the churches of Christ everywhere. And this one was signed not by a patriarch, but by the Holy Synod of the Ecumenical Patriarchate at a time when its seat is actually vacant. So ecumenism is the mentality of a church, not just of an individual. Still, it was the unique personalities of Metropolitan Meliton of Chalcedon and Ecumenical Patriarch Athenagoras that loom large in Bartholomew's education at Halki Theological School. His later graduate studies exposed him to the Catholic Church in Rome, the Protestant Communion in Munich, and the World Council of Churches in Bossey. He was at Meliton's side, advising the previous patriarch, Demetrius, on interchurch and interfaith matters. He was a long-standing member of the central and executive committees of the World Council of Churches, also serving as vice president of its Faith and Order Commission. And he participated in 3 general assemblies of the World Council of Churches. When the newly elected, at the time, Archbishop Iakovos of North and South America visited Pope John the 23rd, 1959, the first encounter between a representative of Constantinople and a Pope of Rome in over 400 years. Bartholomew was there as a young deacon, a canon law student in Rome. He also witnessed the historical lifting of the anathemas between the two churches in 1965 by Patriarch Athenagoras and Pope John Paul VI. And he co-edited the volume entitled Tomos Agapis, or Volume of Love, with the official correspondence between the Vatican and the Fanar from 1958 to 1970. I could list much more. The return of the relics by John Paul II in 2004 to Constantinople, the restoration of the official dialogue between the Orthodox and Roman Catholics with Pope Benedict XVI in 2006. More recently, the very close partnership and friendship with Pope Francis, with whom he celebrated the 50th anniversary of that lifting of the anathemas, again in Jerusalem. Bartholomew is profoundly conscious of his responsibility in advancing the gospel call for unity. and at the same time does not shy from self-criticism. At the Assembly of Orthodox Primates held in Istanbul in January 2016, he retorted against hierarchs censuring the immoral standards of the West, and Bartholomew cautioned that we must be more honest with ourselves to admit that our own cultures and countries are not exactly basking in holiness. And at the Holy and Great Council of Crete in June 2016, during a heated, albeit pitiful and painful debate on whether other Christian churches, you guys, could even be labeled churches, the Patriarch uncompromisingly quipped that he would never allow centuries of patristic tradition and decades of ecumenical progress to be jeopardized by ignorance, at least not on his watch. As a result, however, he has consistently paid the price in a church often obsessed with a narrow interpretation of doctrine. It is a cost he's willing to pay out of a sense of conviction and commitment in the face of all those who brand ecumenism as a pan heresy. And so Bartholomew promotes ecumenical discussion with, not against, other Christian churches and faith communities, because Orthodox are unfortunately sometimes incapable of defining their identity except in contradistinction from others. But Bartholomew knows that Orthodoxy does not define itself against foreign or fictional enemies, that the challenge of ecumenical dialogue is not to convert, but to converse with society, to bear the cross of and bear witness to the world. And in this, he will persevere and persist to his last breath. The second figure I want to talk about is my previous Archbishop in Australia, Stylianos Archdeacon, who died just a few years ago. And I wanted to speak about him because persistence alone, it doesn't quite cut it. Ecumenism also requires integrity. Persistence without integrity is futile and fruitless. And Stylianos Archdeacon, former Archbishop of Australia, personified, for me at least, an ecumenism of integrity. Many regarded him as hard-headed and hot-blooded, and he was. But from an ecumenical perspective, he was recognized for transparency. Stylianos studied in the same place, the same period as Bartholomew at Halki. And afterward, he completed graduate studies at Bonn University, where one of his professors was Joseph Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict XVI. He subsequently taught at the universities of Thessaloniki and Sydney, where together we established St. Andrew's Theological College, the first and only accredited Orthodox institution of higher learning down under. A prolific essayist, an acclaimed poet, Archdeacon surrendered a literary and theological career for a pastoral ministry. His ecumenical achievements include co-chairing the first Orthodox Anglican dialogue in Oxford in 1976, and serving as the founding co-chairman of the Orthodox Catholic dialogue from 1980 to 2000, until inter-Orthodox dissent over uniatism frustrated bilateral conversations. Stylianos's ecumenical philosophy is epitomized in the names of two theological journals that he founded. The Journal of the Patriarchal Institute of Patristic Studies in Thessaloniki, Greece, where he served as abbot, is entitled Kleronomia, which denotes heritage or legacy. And the Journal of St. Andrew's Theological College in Sydney, where he served as dean, is entitled Phronima, phronema, which signifies mindset or spirit. For Stylianos, ecumenical dialogue should be marked by respect for a tradition inherited over 2 millennia, but it should never be reduced to conformism. It requires honesty before God, others, and ourselves. As one of his closest confidants, I can say that the only thing Stylianos could never, for a moment, endure, not even pretend to, was hypocrisy. He knew very well, for instance, that Catholics were as likely to concede any claim to authority as Orthodox were to compromise any claim to authenticity. He also recognized that the dilemma of any one individual church directly and proportionately impacted all of the other churches. And like Bartholomew in the Orthodox Church, Stylianos paid a heavy price for his ecumenical conviction. I remember people yelling out in church and throwing fruit in church as he was preaching. It is an unfortunate reality that an anti-ecumenical spirit runs hot within the Orthodox Church at nearly every level of its organization. As such, unfortunately, we Orthodox are either perpetually threatening withdrawal from bilateral and multilateral settings, or else perennially insisting on separate statements and separate services, or voting abstention and special commissions. It often seems as if we're happier pronouncing clamorous complaints than pursuing constructive solutions. Perhaps even, I might dare say, someone like Father Florovsky set the stage for this mentality when he insisted on the unique role or the special responsibility, the extraordinary character of the Orthodox, as if there could be an Orthodox perspective to life and suffering and justice. That binary approach to theology and to life is something that Archbishop Stylianos would never tolerate. It is precisely the sort of duplicitous response that I find unjustifiable and objectionable in the World Council of Churches' response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. For almost an entire year, to the day, in half an hour to the hour, the World Council of Churches resisted any call to condemn the despotic Russian Federation by embracing its moral obligation clearly and categorically to censure the Moscow Patriarchate as a puppet church. And what's worse for me, all this despite the fact that first, the Moscow Patriarchate is one of the most powerful and influential members of the World Council. And second, during this time, the World Council was led by the only Orthodox General Secretary in its history. Thankfully, the new General Secretary, not Orthodox, Dr. Jerry Pillay, has explicitly and consistently denounced what he calls the illegal and immoral war of Russia. Because you see, for me, the war in Ukraine is a litmus test for the honesty and sincerity of the Orthodox Church toward dialogue and reconciliation. And this time, the test is in our own backyard. If we Orthodox can't own the situation in Ukraine, how do we expect others to react? How can one not question the purpose of inter-Orthodox relations when 1 year into the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, with the exception of Bartholomew, no Orthodox head of church has denounced Russian Patriarch Kirill's actions? And by extension, should we not also question the purpose of ecumenical relations when participating churches are not held accountable for such flagrant violations? While individual churches like Scandinavia, Germany, and Poland as you'd expect, along with global communions, notably the Lutheran, Reformed, the Methodist, and the Anglican communions, have adopted a more critical stance toward Russia. Most ecumenical institutions seem comfortable enough adopting the softer, frankly, painless and cost-free approach of praying for peace in Ukraine. For example, a recent high-level meeting of the Conference of European Churches delegates discussed, I quote, how the war in Ukraine has been perceived in their countries. Really? If ever member churches should reevaluate their ecumenical vocation, it's now. If ever the World Council should reassess its prophetic voice on justice and peace the way these were highlighted in your service this evening, it is now. In Bob Dylan's words, how many times can a man turn his head and pretend that he just doesn't see? The answer, my friend, the answer, my friends, is blowing in the wind. So how do we miss it? Stylianos certainly would not have missed it. My third example is Professor Nikos Nisiotis. Persistence and integrity I've spoken about, and these might otherwise constitute a recipe for despair and pessimism unless accompanied by the torch of hope. Nikos Nisiotis represented for me an ecumenism of hope. Nisiotis was my professor of philosophy and psychology of religion at the University of Athens. Few Orthodox theologians have better been able to interpret Orthodox theology to the West than Nisiotis, who was equally comfortable conversing with Thomas Torrance in the UK and John Cobb in the US, as with John Meyendorff in the US and George Cordra in Lebanon. He studied under the likes of Karl Barth and Carl Jung. And in the Orthodox world too, Nisiotis was misunderstood. Nisiotis was maligned, a charismatic lay theologian who, by the way, was credited with developing basketball in Greece and was also a member of the International Olympic Committee. I would see him every 4 years awarding medals. Nisiotis reflected the pioneering character of ecumenism as a grassroots movement. His mere presence stood up to and stood firm against abuses of authoritarianism, professionalism, and clericalism. It is regrettable, I think, that in ecumenical engagements, dialogues, ecumenical bodies, Orthodox have been represented almost exclusively by hierarchs, while formal endorsement of ecumenical dialogues is almost universally implemented on the synodal level. It's lamentable that there are few lay theologians like Nisiotis, or for that matter, Vladimir Losky, or Paul Evdokimov, and still fewer women. Nisiotis was one of the pioneers of the World Fellowship of Orthodox Youth called Syndesmos, established in 1953. He was the first Orthodox to present a keynote address to a General Assembly of the World Council of Churches in 1961. He was a participant in the first Pan-Orthodox preparatory consultation for the Holy and Great Council in Rhodes. That was in 1961. Official observer at the Second Vatican Council in Rome from 1963. Deputy Secretary General of the World Council of Churches from 68 to 72, and chief contributor to the pioneering document, Baptism, Eucharist, and Ministry in 1982. He would have deserved your award. Nisiotis articulated and demonstrated his passion for dialogue on all levels of church and society. His teaching at the Ecumenical Institute of Bosse, that International Center of Education at the World Council of Churches, offered him the opportunity to appreciate how theology can inform the world and to shape an entire generation of scholars and clergy, including later prelates and patriarchs like Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew. For Nisiotis, ecumenism was serious business. His eyes would flash in anger at excuses for unjustified standoffs or standstills, for church aloofness and smug isolation. To quote Florovsky again, reconciliation is crucial because the ecumenical movement is an antinomical venture. Its ultimate aim is Christian unity, but its starting point is Christian disunity. And elsewhere, Florovsky adds, we must suffer from our unhappy divisions. A real desire for unity can emerge only from an experience of failure. That's the starting point. That's keeping your feet on the ground. Olaf Tveit, former WCC General Secretary, speaks of not just a reconciliation, but accountability. We already touched on this apropos Ukraine. For Tveit, part of the process, part of that journey of unity must invariably include reconciliation in the sense of mutual accountability. So ecumenism implies a sense of forgiveness, of making space for one another. Such an eschatological vision allows room for other individuals, other communities, and other confessions. It may be helpful to recall that the origin of the Greek word for forgiveness literally means sharing the same space with one another, in the sense of accepting, in the sense of accommodating one another. Nisiotis would say, it is the operation of the Spirit that fills gaps, unites oppositions, bridges distances, and links the diverse gifts of grace. But what above all distinguished Nisiotis was his emphasis on hope, a conviction he inherited, of course, from German Reformed theologian Jürgen Moltmann. The relevant New Testament passage in the first letter of Peter was among his favorites and most quoted. Always be prepared to make a defense to anyone who calls you to account for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and reverence. For Nisiotis, being saved by hope, and I quote him, implies suffering in anticipation of salvation with and for the world. There can be, he wrote, no confession of faith without solidarity with the world. That's what our service this evening talked about. The realism of Christian hope, he said, eliminates every simplistic self-righteousness. So for Nisiotis, theology was about encounter, about exchange in the world and with the world. His classroom was quite literally a window to the world. He was convinced that, again I quote, orthodoxy must give up defensive, confessional, or apologetic attitudes and become a river of life, filling the gaps, complementing opposites, overcoming enmities, and driving forward towards reunion. Moreover, just as there can be no separation between church and world, for Nisiotis, there could be no dichotomy between faith and science. He would reach out to and build bridges with medicine and technology. He would have been appalled at the response of the Orthodox churches to COVID, another abysmally failed litmus test, this time between religion and research. We called the pandemic a global crisis, a Greek term that indicates that we are judged, crisis, by our reaction to defining moments. Among the many lessons we learned from COVID, I mean, apart from the fact that there are so many crazy people in the world, and that a good number of them are in our churches, is that crises tend to reveal the very best in human nature, but also typically expose the very worst in human ignorance. With the lockdown restrictions over the last years, it was sometimes difficult, I admit, to discern whether religious leaders, or some of them at least, were more interested in promoting conspiracy theories or protecting themselves against imaginary medieval enemies. COVID-19 displayed just how unprepared our religious communities frequently are in responding effectively to critical challenges. The far-sightedness of faith should serve as an instrument providing not a pretext for escape, but a bedrock of hope. That's the lens through which Nisiotis saw the world. So let me try and tie this all up together. If the ecumenical movement is to have a credible and courageous voice in our time, in our world, then it must return to the foundational principles of humility and sharing. Religious leaders must speak together against violence and greed. They must work together against aggression and exploitation. I'm not proposing a simplistic socio-political manifesto, certainly not saying that we should get rid of dogmatic teachers. That's not the issue here. This is my deep-seated theological and ecumenical conviction. Individual churches and communities cannot continue gazing within themselves or obsessing with one another. Their focus should be outward-looking. That's what it means to be Catholic, global, truly ecumenical. In the technical jargon of ecumenical circles, the debilitating dilemma whether ecumenism should be embedded in doctrine or exemplified in service has been summarized in the ecumenical circles in the contrast between ecumenism in time and ecumenism in space, again, originally formulated by Father George Florovsky. Orthodox churches routinely plead for the former. Western churches normally identify with the latter. But it surely cannot be just a matter of either or. Ecumenism should not be limited to an academic enterprise or a comparative study of doctrine, liturgy, and spirituality. Ecumenical scholars cannot exclusively focus on theology, just as ecumenical bureaucrats should not expressly minimize doctrine. A sincere ecumenical perspective is shaped by mutual reception or reciprocity. We're called to generate a broader concept of ecumenism than we're accustomed to. We need an ecumenism of generosity and humility, not of presumption and arrogance. An ecumenism of learning and loving, not of competition or imposition. Such an ecumenism would not depend on specific outcomes, whether doctrinal statements, traditional practices, or liturgical agreements, not outcomes, but should instead be defined as a specific outlook. Perhaps an unrealistic expectation of ecumenical outcomes is what led to the disappointment, even discontentment, over ecumenism by Popko, Harricus, and Florovsky. I am still astounded by the cutting-edge call of the patriarchal encyclical of Joachim III in 1902, saying that the Orthodox Church leaders should seek, I quote, points of encounter and contact, even turning a blind eye, he says, to irregularities. That's an Orthodox Patriarch of Constantinople. I'm glad to belong to that church, because the openness of Christian witness is a journey ultimately from I to you, a movement from mere existence to coexistence, and that calls for breaking away from parochialism, sectarianism, and exclusivism, an ecumenical outlook, not ecumenical outcomes. An outlook sustained, sincere, and sanguine should be the vocation of all, including Orthodox. Patriarch Bartholomew would insist that Orthodoxy should never be afraid of dialogue with the world. Archbishop Stylianos would underline that without dialogue, there's only alienation and isolation. And Nikos Nisiotis would argue that the ecumenical movement is a dynamic process of mutual encounter by the churches as channels of grace for the whole world. Dear friends, ecumenism cannot be separated from the world. The purpose of ecumenical dialogue is that the world may believe, that the world might have life and life in abundance. Faith demands of us to inform the lives of those around us and transform creation in its entirety to the least of our brothers and sisters and to the last speck of dust. Because whenever we narrow life, even religious life, to ourselves or our own concerns or our own fears, we neglect our vocation to reconcile all creation. The power of ecumenical dialogue lies precisely in opening up beyond ourselves, beyond our confession. It involves speaking the language of care and compassion. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis speaks of becoming painfully aware of what is happening in our world. I would add, it means becoming personally impacted by the violence wrought on people and nature in Ukraine, personally troubled by the subtler violence inflicted on the poor globally, personally affected by extreme storms, increasing droughts, and the spilling of hazardous materials. Care for creation can actually bring us divided, insulated believers before a common task. In this regard, I would say it's gratifying to see that the Anglican Orthodox dialogue has more recently focused on such subjects as the human person and climate change. And coincidentally, the two joint documents published by this commission are subtitled A Hope-Filled Anthropology and A Hope-Filled Ecology. Over the years, my ministry has effortlessly shifted from ecumenical involvement to ecological investment. I discovered in Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew's environmental imagination an invaluable counterbalance to ecumenical idealism. Because you see, while people may think of ecology as trees and bees or sun and soil, it's not just that. It's about the social nexus that surrounds them. This is the ecumenical imperative of creation care, the recognition, the conviction. Again, this is exactly what we prayed for in the service, that our interconnectedness with the rest of creation informs us that the earth unites us all before and beyond any confessional and doctrinal or any political and racial differences. We may very well not share religious convictions or ethnic particularities, but we certainly do share an experience of nature, the air that we breathe, the water that we drink, the ground that we tread. By some mysterious connection that we do not always understand and sometimes, admittedly, even choose to ignore, the earth reminds us of our calling to be humble and to share. So for me, the foundational principles of ecumenism may be compressed into these two simple words: humility and sharing. Gospel precepts, gospel mandates that sustain an ecumenical outlook that is truly universal and Catholic, as well as mutual and reciprocal. Thank you.